Welcome, everyone, to Unsafe Space, Deprogrammed on Unsafe Space. I'm your host, Carter Laren. I'm here with co-host, as always, Keri Smith. Keri, say hi.
Hi, guys.
You can follow the show at Unsafe Show on Twitter. You can go to YouTube, where Unsafe Space is the channel name, and you can go to unsafeshow.com. We have Facebook pages for both Deprogrammed and Unsafe Space, so feel free to follow us there. Today we're talking about fighting racism with racism, and in particular we have on Dr. J.R. Miller. He is a professor of applied theology and leadership and the dean of online learning at Southern California Seminary. Dr. Miller has 20 plus years of pastoral ministry experience and a diverse educational background in science, theology, and philosophy. He's authored multiple books on church history, biblical theology, and leadership. Joe and his wife, Suzanne, enjoy the sun and surf with their 3 sons in San Diego, California. He also runs morethancake.org and a video blog called Off the Cuff Videocast. Dr. Miller, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here with you guys and connect.
Yeah, great to have you. So we got connected actually because we read this article that you wrote titled, "I choose not to combat racism by becoming a racist." And I think a lot of people maybe don't understand the kind of neo-Marxist, I think you call it neo-Marxist social justice construction of the concept of racism. Maybe you can start by just telling our audience, what that concept is and maybe what you think some issues are with that concept.
Sure, absolutely. And it is great to connect with you guys. And I actually came across you guys, just so everyone knows. I think Keri had written an article, I think it was last year, 2017, when I was doing some research and what are people talking about this issue, and came across her writing. I quote her in my article because I thought she had some good insights. And then I kind of internet stalked you guys and found out where you were. And so it is good to connect. And so I think you've been dealing with this issue in different podcasts that I've seen, or videocasts you guys have, and some writings. But what I mean by this is that, we can all use the word racism, and it's sort of like a buzzword that nobody wants to be a racist. Everyone wants to be against it. But the problem is, how do we define it? And I'll tell you, the danger of just using a word that's undefined is the best analogy I can come up with is if you have somebody who is a sexual predator, they use these grooming techniques. They're called grooming. And what they do is they talk to, children, and they use words and they use language that makes them feel comfortable with the predator. It makes them sort of ingratiates them to the predator. And then pretty soon they realize they're using these words much differently than the child has the impression of. So if like, oh, I love you, I care about you. Well, if you loved me, you'd let me do X, Y, Z, And so they use these grooming words to gain the confidence of unsuspecting children, and then eventually, molest them or abuse them. And I think that's really what's happening in a lot of the sort of social justice warrior crowd, is that they're using a word that we all say, oh, that's terrible, but they're fundamentally defining it with a worldview that actually promotes the thing that they hate the most, or they say they hate, which is racism. And so, I mean, I can get into details how those are defined, but just make sure that makes sense so far, where my framework for this was.
I think so. And frankly, you reminded me that grooming is one of those words I hate, because I hear like stories about grooming gangs, and I'm like, they're not grooming gangs, they're rape gangs.
Yeah.
But they use this word grooming, and grooming sounds like, to me, when I hear the word grooming, I think of like, combing a dog or something, which is a very nice thing to do.
I think it is. You can certainly conceal the true meaning, and I think that is a danger of any kind of language we use. We can conceal our true intent in a language, and by using this sort of connotative meaning, what the feeling evokes, the word evokes a feeling in the hearer, but we really mean the denotative meaning. We really mean something else by it, but we're relying on the fact that it will be misunderstood as a way to manipulate. And so in that sense, I think the word is valid, but it can be bad. I mean, even the word, sexual offense, what is sexual predation? Well, what does it mean to be offended? Those words all change in very different meaning of what they are. So in this case, with racism, though, the word grooming aside, but for most people, I think historically, as a here and as a Christian, I would define racism as any sort of bigotry that arises, sort of a discrimination that I'm willing to impose on somebody, whether in the way I treat them or the institutions that I build, that are rooted in a dislike of skin color. Okay, so let's put race as skin color. We'll ignore some of the biological implications of what race is, or if it's a social construct, that kind of stuff for now. But just say, okay, your skin color is different, or I don't like you because of this skin color thing. That's what most people would realize. And they say, okay, anybody can be a racist in that sense. But for the social justice concept, because they adapt a new sort of Marxist, what I call the neo-Marxist framework, they say, well, it's impossible for somebody who is non-white to be racist, because racism is defined by power and my ability to control you. And it's not even by quote unquote minority status, because you could be in a minority, like in, say, South Africa, where the white people were the minority population, but they held the power. So they were still in a position of power. So it's not about numbers, it's about pure power. The problem is that if you step outside of those power groups, you don't have any inherent value yourself. And so it's a dehumanizing framework as opposed to the other framework, which recognizes anybody could be a racist.
I wanted to add something here. You're absolutely right that because I used to be in this belief system, as we've talked about, and it's been a concerted effort for them to redefine the terms racism and sexism to include that. They say, just to break it down, it's prejudice plus power. But even within their own definitions, there are problems that are very obvious. And I wanted to know what you thought about these, because they don't, and I think you talked about this a bit in your article. They define power strictly in a collective basis. Like they define it based on what groups you belong to, not on your individual ability to inflict power. So I could be a very powerful individual, but because I'm a woman, therefore I don't have power. They define it based on my group status.
Yeah. So they do this. It's called intersectionality is the fancy word that's used, but it's what it creates is a hierarchy of value. So what people have to understand, and this is why I wrote this particular post, and what I try to work through with my students to understand, is that if we're saying we're in favor of human rights and human dignity, all those kind of words, whatever they might mean to different people, what the social justice warrior, what this group of people really mean by that is that individuals don't have rights. They don't exist because the individual human being has no inherent value or worth in a neo-Marxist system. Only your value as you are a member of one of these groups, these intersecting groups, your participation in that group is what gives you value. So if you are a white male, you're considered to have the most power, therefore you're at the bottom of this rung. So you, Keri, as a white female, you're above the guy in terms of your state of oppression, therefore your value is greater. But if you are a black female, she would be above you on this intersectionality. And so you can go group by group, if transgender black female who identifies as, and you can add all the qualifiers. And that's the reason why all these groups have to add more and more qualifiers, because they're competing for victimhood status. And the more victimhood you can claim, the more justified your position is. But if you step outside of that, like we do our show off the cuff with one of our guys is an African-American, is a black guy. And so Leroy, he has some opinions that are not what a black man is supposed to have. So he's told. So he's told all the time, he's an Uncle Tom, you're not a real black man. And so because he steps out of his viewpoint, which is approved for his racial makeup, for his skin color, it's okay to abuse him. It's okay to verbally assault him. You can call him the N-word, which is taboo, but he can be called those names. It's okay because he's outside of that. He's stepped outside of the bounds of that victim group. So therefore, he no longer has rights as an individual. It's only if he aligns himself with the group status.
That's a great way of putting it. They just real quickly, Carter, I want to add that, like, look at the way they treat Candace Owens. I think we've talked about her before.
I was just going to mention her, so thank you for bringing her up.
We're on the same wavelength today. Well, no, because she's supposed to be a high priestess of the movement. It's you know, she checks off a lot of the victimhood boxes, but because she doesn't preach the ideology, and she rejects the collectivism, she rejects this belief system, then, I mean, she's just fair game. She gets all kinds of abuse from people online. But yeah, I've seen that happen.
It's the thing that bothers me most about this is the fundamental anti-individuality philosophy behind it, right? Yes. And you know, Keri's a Christian, so you and Keri are in the same camp there. I'm an atheist.
I'm a newbie Christian.
That's fine. That's fine. But I'm still an individualist, and even philosophically, I think it's a philosophical contradiction to give groups value without giving individuals value. I mean, groups arise that the value of a group arises from its constituent members, and if each constituent member is equal to 0, then the sum is equal to 0. So you have to value individuals before you can even think about groups. And this is really turning the whole thing on its head, but it's not new. It's you know, you call it neo-Marxism, and you're not the only one. I mean, we call it that too. This really dates back to the Marxist ideology of pitting class against class. Yes. And that didn't work out really well historically, and they've kind of switched their game a little bit. Yeah.
And I think you're right. And the two things that come up is, first, what I appreciate about doing the show, why I wanted to come on today, was because, you know, you are an atheist and Keri is a Christian. And I think that people have to realize this is not a Republican Democrat issue. This is not a Christian versus atheist issue. There's a fundamental worldview philosophy that undergirds this change in how we view people and the value we ascribe to them. Now, you know, Carter, as an atheist, would have a different, say, foundation for saying an individual has value than to say I would as a Christian, saying it's in our created worth, and, you know, how God made us in the beginning, validated in the incarnation of Christ. So I have a theological framework for that undergirds my philosophical the implications for that. You have a different one, but still we're arguing for the same thing ultimately, which is to value the individual. But this what, again, we're calling neo-Marxist framework rejects that. And here's why I would say people have to understand the reason for calling it neo-Marxist. I quote Reinhold Niebuhr. He's the bad brother of the Niebuhr brothers, by the way, for those who know Niebuhr's. His brother actually has some decent stuff. But Reinhold Niebuhr was, you know, he was a Marxist, a committed Marxist. Matter of fact, I got some guy on Twitter asked me, "What's your evidence for calling him a Marxist?" Well, you know, because I say he's a Marxist Christian kind of thinking. Well, he decried what he did was he rejected the Marxism of, say, Marx in the political structure. And he said, well, we could actually take Marxism and apply it to the Western economic systems, and we can still do this. So he sort of went away from what he thought was the political dangers of Marxism, but he wanted the philosophical foundations of Marxism. So while he still talked about middle class and privilege and lower class, you know, the oppressed, he did it by class structure. The neo-Marxism no longer does it by economic structures. They do it by race structures and gender structures. That's why I call them neo-Marxist, because they still want the Marxist worldview. They just have a different way, and as it's not just about money. So they're willing to use other categories. And what it does is, ultimately, I was thinking about this yesterday, contemplating your show, and I haven't even really fully thought this through, but get your opinion on it. So what they really do is they take a Marxist in terms of metaphysics, they take a Marxist axiology, which is the moral foundation for something. And they say that framework is power versus non-power, power versus oppressed. But then they take a postmodern epistemology. It's like, how do we know truth? Epistemology means how we know truth. postmodern epistemology said there is no such thing as truth. It's my feelings determine what truth is. So if you take that Marxist framework of power structure based on my feelings, what that does for the social justice warriors, they say, was, you made me feel offended, therefore you're wrong. Well, how do you know your feelings are more valid than my feelings? Well, I'm in this based on intersectionality. My group is the oppressed group, therefore my feelings determine truth as opposed to your feelings determining truth. So they sort of mix and match those two systems, which is why it's neo-Marxist in that sense too, because they're integrating postmodern epistemology again with sort of this neo-Marxist metaphysics in terms of moral framework. And that's the danger of it that we have to recognize. Again, it's purely dehumanizing. The individual has no value. Therefore, for Niebuhr, it justified in his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, it might be wrong for you as an individual to take a knife and stab me, but for the society to do it, in other words, if there's groups of people that are oppressed, they're justified in overcoming that oppression, killing people, if it equalizes power. Therefore, it's just to do that because the end goal is equality of power.
Which is they're literally saying that the ends justify the means.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And that construction of kind of this, I would call kind of a corrupt epistemological system where it's based on feeling, and the Marxist class structure is a really good way to describe, I think, what they're up to. And if you look at Marxism historically, right, the predictions of Marx failed. The power structures that he thought would fall apart and naturally lead way to capitalism would fall apart and give way to communism because there was this class struggle. That didn't happen. There was a lot of class mobility and general upward movement of everyone's standard of living. And so I think you ended up with a lot of Marxist philosophers in this conundrum where they like the ideology, they like the philosophy, but they can no longer argue it in the same form politically because they would be laughed off of stage. So they have to mutate it somehow, and they've changed it to kind of racial identity and maybe privilege, I'll put in quotes. Yeah. And they're really doing, I think, a pretty good job of pitting us against each other based off of that structure.
Yeah. Again, that's where that idea of, that the language I kind of like is the grooming language, only because, see, they're using there's a kernel of truth in what they're saying. And this is important to note. There is such a thing as racism. Mm-hmm. What I'm arguing, and I think what you guys agree, is it's not a denial of racism. So there's truth to that. It doesn't actually also deny the reality of differences of how society has treated white versus non-white, black and white. And I trace on my blog, I do a whole series. The early Darwinian science, the social Darwinianism of the 1900s, was rampant with the idea of, blacks are lower on the evolutionary scale at the lower end of humanity. We had human zoos where men like Otto Benga were brought in from Africa as an African pygmy and put on display at the New York Zoo in the primate cage, because the best scientists of the day, I mean, these are the people that headed all the federal commissions on science, were saying, look, this is what we know from this sort of application of Darwinian theory, which Darwin himself actually was opposed to. He was opposed to the racist implications of his theory, but his problem was he had no way to get around it, and he knew that was a problem. Even though he was morally opposed to slavery, for example, he knew that his theory allowed for it to be justified, and it eventually was, within his lifetime and in the early 1900s. And so you see that the society did structure things in a way that was oppressive to blacks. And so that did benefit whites. So what I'm arguing is not a denial that there has been oppression, or denial that in some ways there are structures that exist that need to be corrected. But we can acknowledge those two things as true, that racism exists and that there is oppression and that there are ways that systems oppress people, without us accepting these neo-Marxist categories, which inherently dehumanize the very people we say we want to help. So that's the danger. We got to be careful not seeing the kernel of truth and being our hearts being sort of moved towards that, which they should be moved to want to change those things. But we don't have to buy into that system to make those changes. We can make those changes in a way that values individuals and enhances what I would say is their inherent created worth. And so that's an important, again, distinction that we have to make in evaluating this whole this intersectionality and social justice warrior movement.
Yeah, and as you're saying, if we approach it from the social justice perspective, we're actually exacerbating the very problem that we're claiming to care about. So if you do care about racism, and you do want to eradicate racism as your end goal, social justice is the opposite of the way to do that. It's not going to work. Also ignoring that it ever happened is not going to work, and that also will perpetuate racism.
Yes.
Those aren't the only two options, right? There's another option, which is treat people like individuals and recognize there have been oppressed people for various reasons throughout history, and that's wrong. One thing that struck me, I didn't really know anything about Reinhold Niebuhr, and so I saw your quote from him, and one thing that really struck me about him was I recently finished reading Antifa's handbook. And they're very blatant about their willingness to use violence. And for those who don't know, Antifa is pretty. The entire, I'll say, philosophical foundation of Antifa is neo-Marxism, and so, or originally, actually, it was Marxism. So, not just neo-Marxism, but that's their philosophical justification, and they are very open in their handbook about the moral permission to kill and to create violence and to do kind of, there's a group in the Bay Area called By Any Means Necessary, and it's one of the it goes hand in hand with Antifa, and they're willing, as Keri said before, the ends justify the means, killing people and using any means necessary to achieve whatever it is their view of society should be. And again, their view is in terms of classes and groups of people. It's totally fine to do that, and there's no moral qualms about doing that.
Well, and they change, as you pointed out, Carter, once before, they define fascist. So they're technically their name is supposed to mean anti-fascist, which I find kind of crazy because they behave in very fascist ways. Just like you said, it's kind of analogous to SJWs say they're anti-racist or anti-sexist, but they behave in sexist and racist ways. But so they're supposedly anti-fascist, but they what's the point I was about to make? I'm losing.
I bet you it was a great point, though.
It was a great point. I had to go off on the tangent of how it's analogous.
It's not Marxism.
What did you say? Oh, yeah, that was the point. So they define fascist as anyone who's not a Marxist, which is a really large category of people then that you're willing to be violent towards and to use any means necessary against anyone who's not a Marxist. And that's what I saw happening after the election with people on my quote unquote side on the left who were suddenly defining fascist or Nazi sympathizer as being anyone who voted for Trump. And I'm like, well, that's a large category of people that you're okay with. It's like you said, Joe, it's dehumanizing.
Yeah. Well, and I think you bring up, this Antifa thing is a great illustration of some of the issues that come at play here. It's the traditional playbook. It's a communist playbook where you accuse your enemy of the very thing you do, and what it does is you do it before they do it. That way, nobody can. Oh, they're just saying because I said it first, and then in the minds of people who don't know any better, it just sounds like you have sour grapes, so to speak. It just sounds like you're coming at them. Well, your mother, kind of like that's the level of argument it sounds like to the casual observer. Well, they're accusing you of racism, but they are. No, they're the ones, and it just sounds like you're being a petty little baby. And that's what we sound like to people who don't pay attention to the substance of what's being discussed. That's why they do that. So it's very strategic in what they do. But actually, there's an article out today that illustrates your very point. There's a guy who is a part of a group, Antifa, who his name is Joseph or Jose Alcoff. And I don't know if you heard about this. I think it just came out today.
It was the Daily Caller article, right?
Yeah, it was the Daily Caller article, which is interesting. And I read through this morning thinking about our talk today. I wondered if we'd get to this or not, but, I'm not sure how it went. But he goes by Jose Alcoff or Joseph Alcoff. And his one of his secret names that he sort of went by for his more militant side was Jose Martin. But he sort of identifies himself totally secretly on the internet and other places, like basically El Jefe, I guess, the big boss kind of guy. But I read this thing, and it's fascinating because here's a guy who is highly placed in the leftist Democrat circles, and I use that term leftist very distinct from liberal Democrat. Probably most, just so people know politically, this is not a political issue in terms of left right. What probably most moderate Republicans today would have been considered liberal Democrat, probably in the 1960s. And so these terms change in time, what they mean politically. So people can't judge it by that. So I'm using leftist as distinct from even liberal Democrat, what is a traditional liberal Democrat, even though they carry that big D name, it doesn't mean what it used to mean. So these are leftists who are neo-Marxists. And this guy's been on the stage with like California people like Nancy Pelosi and Maxine Waters. He's been on stages, and these people have tweeted out their support of this guy. Yet he is an Antifa guy who has tweeted out things like, Trump would be a great person to have for a public execution, with a guillotine.
Wow.
Should be stabbed through with a pitchfork publicly. Bringing back this sort of Marxist, people with pitchforks coming at the rich and the wealthy. He's called for the wealthy to be burned and killed publicly because they're wealthy. So this is what this guy argues for. This is his philosophical worldview, his neo-Marxist worldview. But he hides it.
That worked well in Cambodia, if I recall.
Yeah.
I think that was a great idea.
Yeah. Mao would have been proud. This is not a white, black, Asian, right? This is a philosophical system that has been adopted by Asians, by blacks, by anybody who's adopted it. It leads to the willingness to kill other people because they are less than human, and I'll give an example, a political example where this is bad on both sides. So it doesn't sound like I'm picking a politics side. Everyone was, I think, rightfully angry at Trump. I have a post on my blog called Trump, MS-13 gang members are not animals, and neither is Trump. So I make both people mad because I think Trump is wrong to refer to those people as animals. And I get there's a point in history where when you could say, oh, those people are animals, there was an understanding because there was a common cultural acceptance that people had inherent worth or value, that you can say that and you were describing their character. We don't live in that world anymore. So I don't like that language in our current culture because I think it is dehumanizing language. Whether people intend it that way or not, it is, because that's the way that our culture frames those words. So Trump is, I think, wrong to say that even these vile gang members who behead people and kill people, to call them animals or dogs or whatever, that's not good language to use today because it doesn't frame well. It dehumanizes these people. It justifies maybe doing terrible things to them because it treats them, they are human beings who do terrible things, is the way it should be said, but we don't need to dehumanize them. But what was justified is dehumanizing Trump for his dehumanization of these people. And you look at the language that was used against Trump, it treated him as less than human. And that also is a danger, because whether you despise what he's done or not, whether you despise what MS-13 gang members do, what we need not do and we cannot afford to do is to buy into these neo-Marxist categories that allow for dehumanization, because that justifies the gulags of Russia, the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, the death camps of Pol Pot. All those things have been built on that same framework. And that is what concerns me. It's not Democrat, Republican. It's not, liberal, conservative. It's this progressive neo-Marxist social justice warrior philosophy that has been tried in history and always proven to result in the death and dehumanization of human beings. And that's what concerns me.
Do you think our conversation has has devolved to the point where, I mean, when we talk about individualism, right, this is, we're built on the foundations of the Enlightenment, and this is where, you know, you have thinkers like John Locke really pushing this idea of individualism and helping change how we think about each other. And it seems to me that we've kind of devolved to the point where we're not really having intelligent conversation. You know, if I'm not a Republican or Democrat either, so I can kind of look on both sides and see there's not really a conversation happening, right? There's the, you know, these guys are animals, and then Orange Man bad, and that's the extent of the dialogue, and it's just screaming back and forth. Have we just gone to? Should we give up and go home? Is there no? We lost our ability to have rational discourse.
Well, I think your observation is right, and I can, you know, I'll give a brief summary of why, and something for people to search if they want to do some research. So if you could look like guys like Locke or Hobbes that are really fundamental to the American sort of system of justice and the way we are, they all bought into some version of natural law theory. You know, so natural law theory was rooted in the belief that somewhere along the way that there was a creator of some kind. It's not necessarily the Christian God or the Christian creator, but it was some sort of Judeo-Christian, loosely deist God creator being that even if it was nature itself that granted it, there was some sort of natural law idea that humanity had certain rights. Therefore, in the Constitution, when it says, you know, we are given by our creator certain inalienable rights, it was not necessarily a Christian phrasing, although it fits okay with a Christian worldview. But there, you know, these guys didn't necessarily have what I would consider a Christian theology, and that's okay. What they were essentially saying is that there is something that the government does not have the right to take away, because it comes from our observations of nature. And you're right, it's the Enlightenment worldview. We can reason our ways into understanding the world around us, and reason tells us that nature must have these inherent values ascribed to humanity, and therefore we can build our systems, and any system that violates that natural law is bad. Any law that violates that natural law is corrupt, and therefore you can't accept, you can fight rightfully against the law that violates nature, the way nature made us. But this neo-Marxist system denies natural law. So that's where the split comes historically. So this neo-Marxist framework says there is no such thing as natural law. We are purely a result of the evolutionary random process, and so there's no foundation for ascribing from nature any moral value to anything. It's just all random. It's all culture. Everything's culturally conditioned or culturally determined. So for the neo-Marxist framework, that's right. What you say there is good, because conversation isn't necessary in that. All that matters is your category. Categories replace conversation. That's the danger. So it doesn't matter what you have to say. What matters is what category are you in? And if you're in that category, and as long as you don't violate what you're supposed to say in that category, then all is well. But if you go outside and say something outside that violates that categorization, the grouping that you've been placed in, then you are persona non grata, you have no value, you can be vilified, and you could be killed, according to some Antifa people and some social justice warrior. You could, according to Niebuhr. It's okay because you are no longer advancing the categorization of what is determined as valuable, of categorization of human beings.
That's absolutely right. I just wanted to jump in quickly about my experience in the ideology. When you say categories replace conversation, that's exactly what they're doing. They don't want a dialogue. They view the belief system as, you know, I've talked about it a lot as being, it functions a lot like a religion in some ways. And so they don't believe that if you disagree with them, you're simply wrong. They believe that you're evil. And that it's not worth speaking with you. And then also they have, because you said, you know, intersectionality, they have this hierarchy, this grouping of who's more valuable and who's not. And the more, you know, victim status you can check off, the more valuable your opinion, and the more you're allowed to speak, the more like a priest you are within the ideology. And so they actually say, you know, one of the ways they avoid dialogue is by saying, Well, our power imbalance is such that it's not even fair for me to have a conversation with you because you're so much more powerful than me because of all of your oppressor groups that you check off. But even the words, like I've been working on this, what I call the SJW lexicon, just like a dictionary of terms and phrases they use. And it's astounding at how many phrases they have that are meant to stifle conversation. Like they use words as a tool to stop dialogue. And so almost all of what I call like their magic phrases are meant to shut you up. It's not meant to find out. It's not meant to explain anything to you. It's not meant to explain their point of view. It's not meant to try and understand your point of view better. It's literally meant to tell you to shut up. So,
you know, and even Keri, there's I've heard this before, and I just did a quick Google search for this actually. They view so traditionally I view logic and reason as, because they're tied to reality, they're a way for us to have a dialogue and kind of reach agreement and understanding together, and kind of you could say, oh, actually this follows from that, and this is tied to this observation in reality, and I can change my mind based on kind of being committed to using reason and logic in conversation. And they're even attacking the use of logic generally as white. And there's a book I just Googled and I found this book right away. There's a book called White Logic, White Methods, Racism and Methodology, right? So there's this whole concept that even having rational dialogue is racist.
Yeah.
And sexist. Don't forget sexist.
Sorry, yes.
And homophobic, if you want to put them
leave
on.
out your oppression, Keri.
Yeah, you know, there's great illustrations of what you guys are bringing up. I mean, Keri, what you talked about ending dialogue. I know Portland had one of their colleges last year. They have a group that says it's for, you know, non-whites only, and that's really the name of the group. I mean, they're pretty clear. If you're not white, white people are not welcome. And they say even to ask a person, like if I were talking with somebody who is Hispanic or from Mexico, and I say, tell me what it's like to be in your experience of XYZ. They say that even asking that question is racist. So to even attempt to have a dialogue with them, they have defined as racism. So they say, well, tell me how it is for the experience of you as a woman. Well, that's sexist for them, because to ask the question is itself racist. And that's exactly what and this is stuff enshrined in college groups. So I think people listening that aren't familiar think, oh, you know, Keri's making that up. That nobody does that. Nobody believes that. It's true. And that goes to what you say, Carter, with the idea of language. Well, it goes even more so. It's language and grammar itself. So you have mathematics that have been determined as racist and sexist and homophobe. Mathematics is, science is, language itself. So that's why you get in University of Washington, I believe it was last year, their department basically said that they came out with guidelines that says holding people accountable to the rules of grammar is sexist, is racist.
Yeah, I saw that.
Because we use the rules of grammar to oppress people because they don't speak like we want them to speak. And those rules of grammar have been established by white Western European culture, which is fundamentally, you know, unsavable. You cannot save Western civilization. This is their viewpoint. So you can't even say that somebody uses bad grammar. You can't correct that, because if you do, you're oppressing them. That in itself is dehumanizing in their view, because it keeps these categories, it keeps the social structures of power in place. And I'm even probably shouldn't use the word dehumanizing, although they'll use it, but they mean something different by that. They just mean you've kept your oppressive power levels there. You're just using it to control them and oppress them. So that's a pretty dangerous thing when you can't use rules of logic, like the law of non-contradiction. It doesn't matter if you are a Buddhist or a Hindu. Ravi Zacharias, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, Carter, but he's a Christian apologist who's, traveled the world for years. He teaches out of Oxford now, one of their little sub schools and stuff, but he's a great guy. He was raised in India, came to Christianity after he tried to kill himself at 17, but he was debating with a Western professor of philosophy here in the United States, and this guy was drawing him on this thing and telling him why the laws of non-contradiction and logic were all made no sense. And Ravi Zacharias, born in India, was basically didn't understand Eastern religion because he was arguing for these laws. And he said to him, he said, I'll tell you this, even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. So in other words,
Yes.
you can say the laws of non-contradiction don't exist and they're a Western white oppressive thing. But if it becomes between you and the car, either you are crossing the street or the car is crossing the street at that moment, and one of you is going to lose. And that is not a Western white concept. That is a reality that we all have to face. But they don't want to face that.
Yep.
Very dangerous.
I mean, I would argue that even using words to try and communicate presupposes the laws of non-contradiction. When you say, the law of non-contradiction doesn't exist, each of those words has a meaning, and you're relying on that meaning to have a unique meaning to me and not something else. I mean, otherwise you would just say like green jello beeble and like that would mean something. Things mean something, and non-contradiction exists. Like there is no, when you say, you could easily just say back to someone who says non-contradiction isn't true, you could just say, thanks for agreeing that it's true. Yeah. Right? They haven't, if it's really not true, they haven't said anything. One of our chatters just gave me a term that I hadn't heard of before, Kafka trapping. Do you guys know this term?
Kafka trapping? So I know Kafka is, but I'm not sure what Kafka trapping is. That's new.
Yeah, me too. So I looked it up. Right.
Okay.
The term Kafka trapping describes a logical fallacy that is popular with gender feminism, racial politics, and other ideologies of victimhood. It occurs when you are accused of a thought crime such as sexism, racism, or homophobia. So it sounds like there's a term for some of what we're talking about here, which is Kafka trapping.
Well, one of I forget who it was. I should have looked it up before we talked about this, but you made me think of it, Joe, at the beginning, was I've heard some people now who are referring to the words like racist, sexist, homophobe, xenophobe, Islamophobe as new slurs, because they can function a lot like a slur if you're using it without any evidence or anything that you can point to why you're calling a person this. It actually, there's a stigma attached to it, and it's meant to isolate a person and to shame them, and it's used a lot like a slur. But that's something that I've heard recently, is people calling them new slurs.
Yeah. Well, and that's true, because the reality of what's going on is that this goes back to the postmodern epistemology that I mentioned at the beginning of the show. So postmodernism really began as a language, is deconstruction of human language. It began as a movement of linguistics that said language itself has no inherent meaning. So the words don't have meaning. They only have meaning because we ascribe meaning to them. Now, to illustrate this, they'll say like, well, for example, and I'll use this with students and stuff, like in Elizabethan England, my understanding is the word cute meant bow-legged. So today, if I say somebody is cute, I say, oh, that means they're attractive or appealing in some way. But if I said that to a woman in Elizabethan England, I would have got slapped in the face because I'm calling her bow-legged. Today, I might say, oh, thank you, or be accused of a sex crime. I don't know. It depends on who I say that to. But, but they're saying, so there's a difference when we say that their language changes in its meaning to saying it has no inherent meaning. So if I point to a table and say that's table, yes, that word is made up. I could have called it a buffoon, like you said, a bubble, whatever. So the word doesn't necessarily have meaning, but it denotes something that has tangible reality and meaning. So, but what they say is there is no meaning, that there is no inherent meaning. So for postmodernism, you get down this rabbit trail of there is no reality outside of my giving my perceived reality. And there's philosophers that we could go into that actually argue this sort of thing. Back in the 1930s and 40s, scientists had the problem with a group called positivists who argued that there is no reality outside of what we ascribe. And physicist Max Planck, I have people want to Google on my blog More Than Cake and just say Max Planck, they'll find an article about why he argued vociferously against this, as did Einstein, who wrote the preface to his book on the modern state of physics. He said, look, when the whole purpose of science is to say that if you run an experiment and I run an experiment, we can confirm there is some objective reality because we can get these same results. If you buy into postmodern reality that denies language has meaning, that denies that there's some sort of objective reality, we have no way to confirm anything is true outside of our experience, because personal experience is the final arbiter of that. And so that's why we end up with this marriage of neo-Marxist kind of metaphysics of what there are categories that are true based on power versus the epistemology of postmodernism, which says my feelings based on my intersectional reality determine the truth. But outside of that, the word has no meaning. So you can say anything you want to me, and what you meant by it is irrelevant, as long as I'm offended by it.
Yeah.
So here's an example. We can take the song, The Baby It's Cold Outside. The song that's like right now,
we're going to do a whole talk about
oh, good. Well, this
help
will be
us out by doing our homework
I
for
won't
us.
mess it up too much for you guys, but like,
no, please, it's good.
Yeah. So here's the thing. In the culture in which that song was, the day in which that thing, when she's saying, what's in this drink and what are you doing to me? There is a cultural facade that must be made. Really what's happening is it's a sexually flirtatious song on both sides. She's not being date raped, drugged with the drink. That's not what she's saying when she says, what's in this drink? She's giving what we would call today plausible deniability.
Deniability, yeah.
Yeah. She's saying, oh my, I think I have a case of the vapors, or whatever, it's she's having oh, I just didn't know what overcame me. She's having a reason to the next day be able to say, oh, I just didn't even know what I was getting into. And culturally it was a nod, wink, wink. Okay, she's okay because she, it was just the way it happened, but we don't have to look down on her because of the circumstances surrounding it. But everybody knew what was really going on. She was just as much complicit in this. But we're saying, well, that meaning then doesn't matter because we're reinterpreting it. He slipped her a Mickey that was this sort of date rape drug, and that's what's really happening, and it's sexual assault. That's reinterpreting. In history, we call it presentism. We're reinterpreting the past through the way we see the present reality, and then that then defines the reality of what that song meant. There's a difference that we can't do that, but that's what postmodernism allows us to do.
So I have another example. You're
dropping for nihilism's sake, right? It seems like the goal is just nihilism, and if you can drop context to destroy something, you will.
Yeah, it's total deconstruction of everything. So you have to deconstruct any existing system because they're all corrupt for a new system that equalizes power. But even as Niebuhr acknowledged, and those before him, such as Marx, that's why you need a perpetual state of revolution, because when the new group gains power, they will inherently do to the other group what has been done to them. Therefore, you need a new revolution. So when you talk about communist revolution, they're talking about a perpetual status. It's okay to have a dictator for a season. Eventually the dictator will no longer be needed. Then you can all live at peace, but eventually the corruption will happen again. And then you have to go through the cycle. It's a cyclical process of power, control, corruption, revolution, and maybe a sliver of peace somewhere in the middle of there.
It's a malevolent view of the universe, I think, in a
yeah, very much so.
Way. Keri, you were going to say something. What were you going to add?
Well, I absolutely agree about that song. She's looking for a reason to stay in a time when you would look frowned upon if you stay, But just a real life example of this thing you're talking about, where experience is all that people point to. Experience is all that's true, and your experience is weighted based on which of these groups you belong to. This happens to me in discussions with SJWs all the time online. And so if you've ever seen this happen, sometimes I like to show people who maybe aren't in this world as much, like this is what they're doing. But if you're having a conversation with someone, this happened to me a couple weeks ago, disagreeing about something. And I think this woman was saying that because Trump was elected, that their very lives were in danger. Just one of those very hyperbolic things. And I was disagreeing with her, and her response was, "You're denying my experience as a queer Black woman." I'm like, no, I'm not denying your experience. I'm disagreeing with your opinion.
Denying your conclusion.
Yeah, I'm disagreeing with your opinion. It's a very different thing. And so don't let them put those words in your mouth. Don't let them tell you what you're doing. I don't know anything about your experience. Your experience is your experience. I'm saying your opinion is wrong. And here's the argument for why I believe it's wrong. But they use these, it's like they have a series of magic words and phrases. And that's one of them. You're denying my experience. Another one, Joe, like you mentioned, it's considered racist or sexist to even ask a person in a marginalized group to explain, or even just to ask them innocently, like you said, what is your opinion on this as a woman? Or they call that emotional labor. So that's how they get out of that one. It's like, it's emotional labor for me to explain to you as an oppressed person to explain to an oppressor. You're asking me to do free work, so, but that's another way not to have to, that's a way that they avoid actually making an argument or to defending, that's a way to avoid defending their opinion. Yeah.
Well, you're trying to force their experience of what truth is, and there's no difference between their experience and truth, remember, because those define. So you're not arguing against their conclusion. You, in their worldview, you are arguing against their experience, because there is no difference between their experience and truth and reality. So that's how they see it, and they're very genuinely, I think, deluded, but they're very genuine in that thing. I mean, I have to believe that there's some people that know that that's not true, but I think the people ingrained in this, that are taught in this, they don't understand the difference, and that's exactly what you're saying is kind of new words for me that they have to describe it. They labor for their thing, but that's
emotional labor. Yeah,
emotional labor. It's but it makes sense within their worldview and their scheme, how that fits together.
Could I ask a question? One part of your article that was really interesting to me, as Carter said, and he's outed me as a Christian before. I mean, I'm just kidding.
I'm so sorry, Keri.
No, it's fine.
Her work for
it's a good thing you don't live here in the Bay Area, or you would be it'd be hanged.
Well, the only reason I say it that way is because I'm very new Christian, and so I guess I'm afraid of being a bad representation. So I'm always very careful to be like,
hey, way we all are. So that's okay,
So anyway, my question about your article was, I thought it was very interesting. I said to Carter after I read it that it seemed to me that you were arguing that Christ is an antidote to both racism and to an antidote to SJW belief system. Would you say that that's your view, or? I think we lost your audio.
Yeah, your audio disappeared.
Uh-oh. Joe, we can't hear you.
We lost him.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
I switched off my Yeti. For some reason, something is conflicting with the Google, with the Chrome, and it's pulling off my Yeti mic. So
I think Google is just listening to the conversation.
Yeah. It's probably not far from truth. So hopefully I'm sure it's not as a good audio, but at least you can hear me, so that's better.
No, but it works.
So here's the thing, in answer to that question about Jesus, and again, with respect to Carter, I know that we would have different frameworks for this, and I'm on your show, so I don't want to be disrespectful of your views on this.
I don't care. It's called Unsafe Space. Talk about whatever you want. I'm not going to get into it.
That's good. But so yeah, I do believe, and from my perspective, I think the nature of who we are in Christ as God, and God who created us, is the only true worldview solution to this, because it's the only consistent metaphysical, epistemological kind of worldview that answers all of these questions equally, in my view. So, for example, if we are inherent, I prefer the term of human sacredness over human dignity, because human dignity is what's like the UN resolution on human dignity. But when they gave that statement on what is the sort of the consensus on human rights. What they said was, these are sort of the rights that we can all agree upon. So it's only by cultural consensus that we say that people have these certain rights. It does not make any attempt at a metaphysical grounding for why people have those rights. And it allows for the idea that those rights can change with culture. So it's not true. In some cultures, it is okay to rape. In some cultures, it is. And for the social justice world, it is okay to kill. In social justice, it is okay to do those things. And from there, if they then have the dominant cultural definition of those things, then their definition of rights is no longer based on individuality, it's based on intersectionality, right? So that becomes the danger of saying we have no sort of ontological metaphysical grounding for human sacredness. So what we have in the person of Jesus Christ is that if God created us with inherent worth, inherent sacredness, that I can't, even if I am in a moral MS-13 gang member, like I said earlier, even if I, I'm a Trumpian type person who, savages people and has language that dehumanizes, regardless, I still don't lose my human sacredness, even though I'm attacking somebody else's. I as the person being attacked, still must treat that other person with an inherent worth. And so respond to them, not in a way they treat me, but in a way that values who I believe God has made them. And so when we have Christ, the incarnation of Christ, and we just talked about this yesterday we did a Christmas special for Off the Cuff, and we talked about the value of the incarnation of Christ as God took on human form for the purpose of redemption. By doing that, he demonstrated there is an inherent sacredness to human nature that was valued so much by God that I don't have the right, regardless of how I feel or my experience, to dehumanize or do something evil to someone else in payment for what they've done to me. It doesn't mean I have to socially accept it. So for slavery, for example, that sort of mentality was used by segregationist Southerners to justify oppression. As well, this is how God created us, all this sort of things. So you have to bear with the way the world systems are. No, I don't have to accept injustice, but to rectify injustice, I am not permitted to do more injustice. I have to resolve injustice by still recognizing the inherent sacredness of other human beings. And that's what I think I find only in the biblical revelation of how we were created, and also the incarnation of Christ, and what that was, what the scripture says that was given to us for the purpose of why Christ came. So that's my way of, I think, approaching this holistically, that I think resolves that question, Keri.
I'm going to surprisingly agree with most of what you just said, and I don't want to get into a debate about
that's fine, yeah,
religion at all. I'm not a theologian.
I understand. Yeah, that's not the purpose of the show, and I agree. That's not where we want to.
Yeah,
totally
no. But I will say I agree with a lot of what you said in the sense that I do think it is. I do think we have to ask ourselves why Western culture evolved on a Christian framework. Right? It was Christian thought, and even if you want to just call them deists, it was people ensconced in the Christian ethic that came up with this idea of looking at natural law and individual rights. And I do think, just as an outsider, right, I'm neither a philosopher nor a theologian, I see that philosophy did a pretty decent job, at least in the West, of tearing down Christianity over the past couple centuries, really, but it's been a long, culturally, it's been really a negative impact to Christians, the existence of philosophy, but what philosophy didn't do, which I think is required, is exactly what you said is necessary, which is they didn't develop a system that was consistent metaphysically and epistemologically to replace it. So I think it's very difficult for people who, if you don't have religion, you end up often just kind of absorbing random ideas culturally and philosophically, and whoever's controlling the universities kind of is ultimately responsible for feeding you those ideologies, and you don't have that consistency. And so, another show, perhaps we could debate whether or not that that consistency is necessarily from Christianity, but I do agree that that philosophic consistency and that foundation is necessary. And I think it's lacking in every mainstream ideology or every mainstream philosophy other than Christianity. And I think it's a lot of work to acquire that on your own if you're not a Christian. So we'll agree on that. I don't want to end on a sad note, but I want to ask you about something because I'm the father of a 9-year-old daughter, and I read something in your article that broke my heart.
I know what you're talking about now. Yeah,
I'm gonna try not to tear up.
I'm with you.
Tell us about Mackenzie Nicole Adams. I had no idea about this, and it broke my heart. And I don't want to end on a bad note, but I don't want to not talk about it because it's really
So I actually inserted that little story as an illustration after I published the original article because I had read it, and I think people reading what I wrote in my article on choosing to combat racism by not becoming one, and the neo-Marxist framework and all these social justice warrior people think that there's I'm distorting or deforming what these people are really saying. And I think you guys probably get that same thing too. No one really says that. You guys are just, you're creating straw man arguments and such. But I thought, here's a story that, I'm with you too, Carter. I read this story and it was one that really devastated me emotionally. It was hard for me to even repost what this story is with this young girl, just because of the emotional anguish it creates. But I think people need to understand this is why I speak against this neo-Marxist social justice warrior framework. It's not because I dislike those people. It's not as we've said, a Christian versus non-Christian, atheist kind of thing. It's not a Republican Democrat. This is a philosophy that dehumanizes and destroys based on categories of intersectionality. This is essentially this girl's story, is that this young girl in the UK, she was 9 years old. Was it 9 years old or ninth grade?
Yeah, she was 9.
Yeah, she was 9. Yeah. Her name is Mackenzie Nicole Adams. And so what happened was she was in a school, and she's a black young girl, and so she's black, and she made a friend with another 9-year-old boy who was white. And her other black friends, who are being raised in this system of philosophy, this neo-Marxist system of worldview, the way of viewing the world, told her basically that they bullied her and they were attacking her, and they told her, quote, that you should kill yourself. You think you're white because you ride with that white boy. You ugly black N-word, I'm assuming. Just die.
It was actually a female dog word. But
okay. I didn't know because I didn't even see it. It was all blank. I didn't give any letters in the story I wrote. But I've heard that my friend Leroy gets those other things because he doesn't have those views. But this 9-year-old little girl, because she dared to have friends with somebody of a different skin color, was told that she wasn't a real black girl, that she was trying to be white, as if whiteness, and this is why I reject in the article terms like whiteness or all those sort of white power things, because you cannot use those words without adopting this framework. And they bullied this girl into hanging herself.
I can't even imagine a 9-year-old girl hanging herself at all and being that bullied. And the stuff they said, kill yourself, just die, blah, blah. Yeah. It's really heartbreaking. And like you said, it's an illustration that this ideology has consequences. And I think, her story is a great example of just, she's innocent, right? You can't attribute anything ill to a 9-year-old girl befriending someone. And it's not just that, I think other people will be like, oh, that's just bullying, but it's a kind of bullying that, most bullying is frowned upon, but this is a kind of bullying that is not condemned by social justice.
That's the other tragedy in this. Not just that her life was so devalued, that she had so little value for herself that she took her own life. Mm-hmm. But the sorrow in this is also that the culture itself that accepts this neo-Marxist framework of racism and defines it so poorly. This is justice, because you've eliminated a human being who dared to challenge this intersectionality framework. They were happy. Those children were happy to have her take her own life because she was compromised. She no longer had value because she went outside these groups and her value was only in the group. Now people would say, oh, that's not true again, but where have you heard people that are social justice warriors decry this? I have not read it. Now maybe somebody somewhere did, but I have not read anything from leading people that lead this movement, because for them this has to be swept under the rug. Because the truth is, and I know how I sound when I say this, the truth is the leaders in this group are not grieved by this story.
No.
They are not saddened by this.
And Keri and I actually disagree with this sometimes about
publicly they'd say they were.
They're not well-meaning. They're doing this intentionally.
I think that Carter and I disagree on this to some extent, because in my experience in the movement, there's I would say roughly two types of people. The ones who are leading the movement, as you said, the leaders are not grieved by this. Absolutely agree. The leaders, the people at the forefront, the people who make money off of the belief system, who I call professional SJWs, most of those people, and just anecdotal experience people, they don't have good intent. And I don't believe that. I believe they know what this is, but the thing they value most is power. And so, and this ideology is a means to an end of attaining more power for themselves. But then there are also people, and this is where Carter and I disagree, is I do believe there are, and this makes me very sad, is that I think there are a lot of people in the movement who are out there being used as puppets, who are being used as spokespeople for it, who are spreading the good word, of SJWism. And a lot of those people are well-intentioned. I do believe some of them are well-intentioned, and they've been, it's almost like these words that you're talking about, like grooming, they've been groomed. They've been told that this very racist, very sexist, very hateful, and very evil, I believe it's a very evil ideology. They've been told that it's the opposite of all those things. And so in order to be anti-racist or to be anti-sexist or to be someone who's against hatred, that they need to go out and preach this thing, and which it's incomprehensible to me. That it makes me very sad, because I know well-intentioned people who are still wrapped up in it, and who believe maybe certain tenets of it. Maybe I wouldn't say or the whole, in the whole back, but they believe certain parts of it, who use these words, these phrases that I think are I don't know. I think it's a dangerous thing to start speaking in some of their language. So
Carter, just to clarify, I don't think we disagree on that, Keri. I think you convinced me about the two different categories of people in the movement. So,
oh, good. Well, then I've gained new respect for you, Carter. You agree with Keri?
Nice.
So she is above you in the categories of So you have to. You're in line. So let me just say, I know you want to close. How much time do you
have, Joe? Because we've got a question from a chat person, but I don't want to keep going.
I can go for a few more minutes, and I do have a positive way of closing on this, because I don't want to end on a negative note either. But I'll take a question.
Yeah,
first.
I'd like to close positive, but if you don't mind, someone asked to you, do you have any opinion on Jordan Peterson's views of religion?
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson is an interesting guy. I think he's an atheist. For those that don't know, he's an atheist professor of psychology coming out of Canada, and he has spoken out quite forcefully against this sort of thing we're talking about today, the social justice warrior, the categorization of human beings by group, all these sort of things. And he refuses to sort of kowtow to this, what he believes is a dangerous thing. I think I've seen him talk on those issues, and I think in the field of psychology, he has a lot of brilliant insight, and I've learned some good things from his perspective on that. When he gets into the other areas of philosophy and religion, I think he's out of his field a little bit, which is okay. I mean, there's always good conversation to be had when we venture out of our field of expertise. So I don't begrudge him on that. I'm not saying he shouldn't speak out in those areas, but I think his view of religion is a bit utilitarian, and I would disagree with that utilitarian nature of religion. Although if we categorize broadly the idea of atheism could be a religion, or social justice, neo-Marxism could be a religion. If you talk about it broadly like that, I can see where he's coming. If by religion you mean Christianity specifically, I think there's reasons that I wouldn't. I would deal with Christians' the idea of Christian theology worldview distinct from how I would define some religious, broadly speaking, worldviews. So I would make a distinction between those that I think is valid, but that's a whole other show. But broadly, I like Peterson. I think he has a lot of good things to say. Outside of his field of psychology, I would take. You just have to realize he's speaking out of his expertise, and doesn't always have a good grasp of some of the nuances in those other areas.
I would say he's a good gateway drug, though, to Christianity, because you get hooked on Peterson. Next thing you know, you're searching out Ravi Zacharias and looking for Tim Keller videos.
I was just gonna say he first of all, he doesn't describe himself as an atheist. He explicitly says he's not an atheist, and he doesn't think anyone is an atheist.
Yeah, you're right. I've listened to his discussions of that. I'm still not sure if that's how to process his distinction. But anyway,
I completely disagree with his whole concept and argument about the distinction between atheism and Christianity. So I think he's out of his element there. But I will say in his defense, both Jordan Peterson and Stefan Molyneux have influenced me by making me more sympathetic to Christianity. Kind of as Keri was saying, because I'm an atheist. Stefan's an atheist. Jordan, no matter what he calls himself, certainly isn't your typical.
Is a non-theist. Let's call him a non-theist, I guess, man.
Sure. But they have both given me more appreciation for Christianity and some of the things that's contributed to society. So he's got that going for him. If you're a Christian, he's probably bringing people over, as Keri said.
Yeah, and I think that's a good transition to at least a final thought, if there's no other questions specifically, that ending sort of tie a little bow on a few things. Earlier in the show, we never got to the question you asked me about, like, should we all pack it up and go home, and what's the end game here? Are we fighting a losing battle type thing? And I think that ties in a little bit with the clear concession you made to Keri about how she bullied you into accepting there are people with good intentions. I'm glad you did that. But if you tie those two things together, I think that's our inroad to saying there is a positive direction we can go with this. And there's a purpose for doing a show like you guys have, for what we're attempting to do on Off the Cuff. And for anybody else out there who wants to do these kind of things, we all have our sphere of influence. And there's people that I think may be confused or believe certain things, and they are well. I have quite a few Christian friends that I've known for 20 years that are buying into some of these things, and it's funny because it's almost like they don't want to hear anything from me because they've accepted the way of categorizing, so they're almost closed the conversation, even though we have long-standing relationships. But I don't want to give up on them, and I have lost lots of friends on Facebook, younger Christians who have, in their Christian worldview, have accepted this neo-Marxist framework and then reinterpret their Christianity as Niebuhr did, in light of giving primacy to this neo-Marxist metaphysic and almost postmodern epistemology, and they've just defriended me because I don't accept the categories and I don't accept this. So that's heartbreaking.
There's a lot of pressure for them to do that in young people's defense. They're under a tremendous amount of social pressure. Yeah,
virtue signaling. You have to show that you believe the right things by saying the right things and decrying the right people. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that there is hope for those who are younger people who are really. There's been some good signals I understand from people in their teens, early 20s that are realizing the flaws of these things, and so there's an important role that we can play in having these conversations, especially. And this is my final thought: and I'm glad to hear you say this, Carter. Is the new atheists like Dawkins and stuff? They're vitriol. And Dawkins is a terrible philosopher. I mean, his books are so chock full of philosophical error, but he's justified because he has the right. He signals the right virtues. He attacks the right people, but he's a terrible philosopher. And I don't say that as a Christian. I say that as a philosopher. Even atheist philosophers recognize this. And the point there being that there's a new kind of atheist philosopher, or that are non-theists, maybe, of whatever the label people want, that are more like the older atheist philosophers that recognize that there's an important dialogue we can have, and we can argue, and we can disagree, and we can have stuff. But there's also points where we can have agreement, like you and I, Carter, in this area, along with Keri, on this sort of dangers of this social justice, neo-Marxist worldview stuff. We can agree with that and still disagree on other things. And I don't have to vilify you. I don't have to call you names or say, well, he's this or that, and decry your lack of intellectual rigor, and just the kind of stuff that works on Twitter and that wins arguments on Twitter, but not in real life.
I'm white. I don't know why you don't use that against me right away.
Yeah, well, I should. Well, because I didn't want to assume your race, but it was part of the problem.
I do identify as a large empty room. So
yeah, so exactly. So I think there's a lot of positive hope here. I think especially as the conversation, as you guys continue on your show, which I think is good because it shows that it's not Republic. We have to get rid of the false dichotomies, atheist versus Christian, Republican versus Democrat, who you voted for versus who you didn't vote for. And, those are such arbitrary, random, subjective, and meaningless categories when it comes to discussions. I mean, they have meaning, like Christian, non-Christian, that has a meaningful designation, but not when it comes to conversation. And
not when it comes to saving Western civilization and having an environment where we have freedom and respect for individuals and can have these conversations, what we both want.
Yeah, I can still value you as a human being, and I have my framework for it. And I have to do that regardless of our disagreements on stuff. And man, that's what we have to start fighting for. And I think we can win in that. I think we can win in that arena. I think there's hope for us in that arena. And I encourage you guys, keep up your dialogue. So I do have a positive, even though I get discouraged in moments of this thing, I do ultimately have a positive outlook. And I pray for a positive result in some of these things. And that's sometimes my only hope too, is prayer. Oh gosh, let it work out, because I don't see a way necessarily, but I have hope there's a way.
Well, that's a great positive note, I think, to end on, because we are over on time technically.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed this discussion. I think it's been a delightful discussion. So I really thank you for joining, and we should probably have you back to talk about some other fun stuff.
Yeah, let me know anytime. I'd love to be back, talk with you guys, and then be a part of encouraging what I think I see you guys doing. I'm not totally familiar with everything, but I'll try to keep track and follow you guys a little bit and see where it goes.
We secretly sacrifice babies on our other channel, but that's
I was about to say that no puppies or kittens were harmed in the making of this show. There's another positive, but okay.
Joe, I was going to say.
All right, well, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Keri.
Oh, no, never mind. I can tell him afterwards. It was very nice to meet you.
It was nice to meet you as well. Both of you.
It was a pleasure to meet you. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and it was a pleasure to have you on the show. So thanks again, and thanks everyone else for watching. Keri and I do Deprogrammed every Thursday at 11 a.m. live on YouTube, so you can find us. Our channel name is Unsafe Space, and we have a Deprogrammed Facebook page and Unsafe Space Facebook page. You can follow us on Twitter at Unsafe Show and go to unsafeshow.com. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll be back, but I can wish you Merry Christmas. I don't know, maybe I'm supposed to say Happy Holidays. Have a good holiday, but we'll be back before Christmas. So see you all then.